anyway, so imagining Autotelic IDEs, I just want to go over this just kind of quickly so we have lots of time for discussion. But so autotelic is from the Greek word for its own purpose. It means an artifact that is like not for the thing that you get out of it. So it's not for creating good code. This would be an IDE that is for the purpose of using the IDE, right? That's a weird question because if IDEs aren't to make a program that we use elsewhere, what are they for? Are they still for making programs? Are we thinking more about the program when we use this? Are we thinking primarily about the IDE? Like kind of what is our experience about if it's not about doing useful work? And I wrote a dissertation on casual creators. I coined the term, and casual creators are basically creativity tools for casual users rather than for kind of doing great creative, like world-changing creative work. These are tools that are used kind of for an autotelic purpose. So creativity as like, this is in the same way that you might use a spirograph to just make terrible art, what is the spirograph equivalent of an IDE? So as part of this, I was thinking a lot about what are IDEs, and this has kind of come into sharp relief because I'm teaching introductory programming at Northwestern. I've taught it for a year and a half now. And teaching introductory programming is a really great way to get you to reevaluate everything that you thought about code. So just trying to explain to students like, hey, I'd like you to install an IDE to write Python in. You have to then explain what an IDE is, and it's actually very hard to get that definition in your head. But kind of the gist is, it's often a place where you will run code, you can annotate code. Sometimes the IDE does like more autonomous stuff, like it makes suggestions, or it like can reformat your code in certain ways, sometimes without you like having to press a button. And then often it has this kind of edit, execute, and observe loop. So like I'm changing my code, I'm executing the code, and then I'm looking somehow at the response of that code. And it turns out there's a lot of ways to like edit code, and there's a lot of ways to execute code, and there's actually a ton of ways to observe code. Also, here's my cat. Okay. And so you can have things like the P5 online IDE, which is a super great tool if you're teaching creative code. Cat, no. All right, here we go. Sorry. Okay. All right. Getting gouged by my cat during a presentation, always good. Okay. All right, so we have the processing IDE, and we can see that it's like kind of, we've written some code, we're running some code, and then it's also like talking back to us about what is going on in the code. But then you also have kind of these like weird environmental IDEs where like you're writing code in one place, and then, for example, you're running it in a web page, and the web page also has all these observational tools. And then I also thought about kind of like, okay, so a lot of us are familiar with the concept of logo and this turtle drawing thing. So logo and this turtle drawing thing are a subset of the actual logo language. Like the logo language did a bunch of other things that nobody remembers because mostly it was a language that kind of excelled at making like little doodly mandalas. And there have been a lot of riffs in different, like, so a lot of people have made IDEs for this kind of logo style drawing program. It ends up being kind of a neat experimental subset of trying to design an IDE for all programming languages. And so you get a lot of interesting experimentation in this space. So these are two of my favorite like logo-ish IDEs. So the one at the top is Joy.js from Nikki Case, and the one at the bottom is an iteration on Scratch that Google did for Hour of Code, where the frozen characters draw snowflakes for you. And all of these have kind of interesting ways to say like, okay, how fast am I going to execute this program? Am I going to execute it instantly, or am I going to execute it kind of over time? And those both have interesting advantages of showing you like what's actually going on with your program. But for example, the frozen snowflake one, I think they're trying to teach kids about code. So they're like trying to show them like, okay, this is what line your code is going on. Like, look at how code goes line by line. But the Nikki Case one is actually much more playful because you can just drag things around and explore this space dynamically. It has instant feedback, and so you get this sort of like instant feedback from your code. A thing to take away from this is the smaller the domain you have, and this is, I learned this from casual creators, the smaller the domain you're working in, the more like restrictions and limitations you have on your domain, the more sophisticated you can get with your feedback. So it's like, okay, if I'm writing Visual Studio Code and I know that somebody is writing a program in a language, but that's about all I know about it, then I have to figure out, sorry, I'm just going to check and make sure that I'm not getting, okay, yeah. Sorry, it's hard to see both output and and the screen at the same time. Okay, so the smaller the domain that you have, the more sophisticated visualization you can have. So if you have like a general purpose language, you can basically say like, well, maybe I know what variable names are, and I can tell if you like are using a variable name multiple times, or I know what keywords are in your language, so I can underline the keywords. But if you actually have things like, oh, I know that this is like trying to draw an image, and that especially in sort of some Brett Victor style work or Nikki K style work, you often say like, okay, I know that this is a number, so if this variable is a number, I might as well put a slider on it, or this variable is a color picker, I could put a color picker on this, and this just like the smaller your domain gets, the weirder the visualization can get. So these are a couple of like, so here's a Nikki Case Loopy, which is sort of state machines, or I guess it's not state machines, but graphs where input from one node will feed into another node. And they can visualize this in a much more clear and like pleasurable way than they could with just a general purpose language, because they know that like, okay, my language is kind of representing this kind of thing. I can just represent this on screen. And then you get like a lot of other interesting spaces. Like if you think about choose your own language or choose your own adventure novels as a language, there's a really cool series of visualizations of like, how do I visualize the program of a choose your own adventure novel? And it turns out you can just build like they've got about a dozen different visualizations of choose your own adventure novels on that page. So you can get like more and more sophisticated visualization of what's going on here. Also, we can think about IDEs with agency. So we can think about things like autocomplete as having agency. So very simple forms of agency, like, you know, what kinds of things are in my autocomplete list. But then you can also have things where it's doing statistical inference. So there's a whole genre of using predictive text on your phone as an entertainment meme. And then we have things like GitHub Colab or Copilot, which is trying to autocomplete for non-autotelic purposes based on what it statistically thinks that like your code could be completed with. But this is not the only things we can do. So I got to visit Dynamic Land a couple of times. So Dynamic Land is a space where you're physically laying out chunks of code on a table. And you as a programmer are programming by moving these sheets of paper around and determining what they point to. And that actually like changes your program. So you can do that as a human, but it turns out you can then also bring in other sorts of agents. And the most fun toys that I saw at Dynamic Land were, you can see a picture, one of these here. So this is a turntable. So you can spin this turntable and actually have like a spinner that the spinner will then determine the flow of your language. But my favorite one, which I can't find a picture of, is they had an RC car. They attached a program to the top of the RC car and started driving that program around the space. And the program would interact with other programs based on where this like agent was moving through the physical space. But you can also think of like, okay, well, how many different agents are operating in this space, and like, are they all symmetrical? Do they have different needs? You can think of kind of like a, what if you had an IDE that had a sort of like Civ style or SimCity style council of advisors? Like, what are they going to be telling you to do? What kinds of personalities do they have? Are they trustworthy? What sort of agency do they have? Are they just allowed to underline words? Are they allowed to change code? Are they just allowed to kind of like make comments in the sideline? And then finally, kind of thinking about IDEs as a thing that has mystery. So this is a diagram from my dissertation on the right. This is what I call the Grok Loop, but it's just the idea that, and this is based on a lot of other people's research as well, or ideation of, okay, well, there's some sort of computational space, um, and I'm trying to understand what that space is. So maybe I've written a program and I want to know how can I understand what this program is doing. So I have to like uh, run that model, or like I have to run the algorithmic space. There's a gulf of evaluation, which is like, okay, what did this thing just tell me? Can I understand what this thing is telling me? And then I'm going to understand that output, hopefully use that to encode something new in this program, change that algorithm. But like, how do I know how to encode things? So that you have kind of these two big gulfs of the gulf of execution and the gulf of evaluation. Like, how do I program this thing, and then how do I read its output? And if you have a particularly mysterious program, either intentionally or unintentionally, this can be kind of an exercise in uh, doing a little bit of detective work. Like, so maybe you have to figure out what kinds of syntax or instructions you even have available. Like, what does this code do? Um, maybe you have, maybe this is a language that is so different that you don't recognize that it has loops and functions. Maybe it has agents. Maybe it has other different kinds of cognitive tools for understanding how to write a program. And so you're trying to learn to think in alien code. Um, and there's not a lot of IDEs that do this, but I would suggest that Zachtronics games are definitely an IDE that is intentionally mysterious that you're trying to write programs in. And part of the pleasure of a Zachtronics game is kind of understanding what alien terms, like what alien constructs he's working with. Um, Maybe loops look very different in this world than they do in the normal world. And then you have things like Mu Cartographer, which is like unclear whether this is a programming language or just kind of like a space explorer, but you're just in a deeply alien IDE trying to influence what's on the screen and try to discover things about like how this world works. So yeah, the final thing that I didn't actually put in my original pitch was IDEs as performance, I think is a big one. And so you could have things like supervisable IDEs. So there's one that I'm trying to build for teaching, which is the idea that like, all right, a student is using an IDE, a student is writing some code. I actually want to be able to say like, I want you to bubble up that code to like 5 TAs and then me as the instructor. And I want to be able to see the outcome of like 60 different little IDEs going at the same time. How are you going to visualize a bunch of students coding in a way that I, the professor, can like reach out to them in class? But you can also have things like multiplayer IDEs, of which there are like uh, a lot of kind of there's like Replit online, which is a common one that people are using kind of a Google Docs for code. But you can imagine like are these co-op? Usually, they could also be competitive. They could also be structured in lots of different ways. Shader.place I gave you as an example of one that you can kind of like play around in. And then yeah, that's just kind of some of the ideas that I had, and I figured now we can move on to the having a group discussion part. Uh, so like what do we actually want to think about? So yeah, thanks for that, like sitting through that rapid fire discussion of like what could these things even be.